Well, good morning. I'd like to begin with a question for you to think about today. What is the most memorable moment in your life from 2019? 2020 is still clouded by COVID, isn't it? So I want us to think back to last year, which actually seems like quite a long time ago. What is the most memorable moment in your life from 2019? Why not just pause and take some time to think about that? If you're watching that with others today, then why don't you pause the recording, take a few minutes to share what it is that your moment is with those around you. For me, my most memorable moment was our family holiday to Disney World in Florida. It was 2 years in the planning, and it was an amazing 3 weeks together. But actually, it wasn't the plane trip, not being on a long-haul flight for years, it wasn't being in America, it wasn't the rides, it wasn't even meeting Mickey Mouse that makes it the most memorable thing, though all those things were pretty awesome. It was actually the experiences that we shared together, the memories we made together, the conversations we enjoyed together, and the many times of laughter we had together. It was memorable because we did it as a family, enjoying just being with one another through a once-in-a-lifetime shared experience. It's actually something as simple as remembering the looks of wonder and amazement and often exhilaration on the faces of my younger children. Or actually sitting on the bus at the end of a day when we came home from a park, we were all exhausted but we just looked at each other, contentedly, because we'd shared an amazing day. We didn't need to say anything. If I stop to think about it, it was actually the relationships that brought the greatest joy out of the experience. And I wouldn't be surprised if the memory that you have, or the memory that you've shared, is most memorable because of a relationship that is at the heart of it. And that's because we value friendships and people above almost anything else, don't we? As I said back in a talk I gave in the summer, when it comes down to it, relationships are what life is all about. And that's because we were created for community. We were created for community. We hunger for meaningful relationships in our lives, and we have a deep need to build genuine community with others. That's what I'd like us to think about for a few moments today, that we were created for community, for meaningful relationships. Now, of course, it's easy to have superficial relationships, isn't it? But I'm talking about relationships that mean something, that make a difference in our lives or in the lives of others. Relationships that change us, that grow us, that fulfill us, that maybe even define us. Relationships that make us more fully human in some way. You see, God tells us in the Bible that we were created for community, for meaningful relationships. In Genesis chapter 2, the Bible reading we heard earlier, God makes man and he gives him a great place to live, where everything is declared so good. But then in verse 18 we read these words. It is not good, God says, for man to be alone. We were made for relationships. It's not good for man to be alone, God says, so I will make a helper suitable for him. We immediately see here that we are made as social beings for fellowship with others. And in the immediate context of Genesis chapter 2, the man finds this, of course, in God creating woman. One like him but different. A relationship where each person complements the other. Of course, in Genesis 2, we see the man and woman living out this relationship in marriage. In verse 24, we read this. This is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Marriage is the deepest relationship that we can have with another human being, isn't it? Two people sharing everything with each other on every level they have, where we're the most honest and open and vulnerable we can ever be with any other human being. But the importance of relationship and of companionship, that we're not fully human on our own, is a principle that applies to every single one of us. We need the companionship, the mutual support of others that relationships provide. As Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 9 and 10 say, 2 are better than 1. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. We were made for relationships. We were created for community because we're made in the image of God. Back in Genesis chapter 1, we read in verse 26 that God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness." And so God made mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. What's God like if we're made in his image? Well, notice the words us and our in those verses. Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. See, the Bible's very clear that God exists as 3 persons in perfect relationship: Father, Son, and Spirit. God is a social being. And part of being made in his image is to be relational, therefore, to desire and need genuine community. That's why we're not complete on our own, as Genesis 2 makes clear. We were made for meaningful relationships with others. And we know this in life, don't we? We even see it. Maybe especially where someone's alone, and I mean really alone, where they have no relationships at all. Maybe a recluse or a hermit or someone in solitary confinement for a long period of time. They retreat into themselves and they shrivel up in some way. There's been much written over the last couple of decades in the field of personal growth and development on moving as individuals from being dependent people to independent people in order to reach our full potential. Actually, what we see here, which some people are now recognizing, is that to be fully independent is not to be fully human. It's interdependence we need to cultivate. Meaningful relationships with others, genuine community with others, where we need people and they need us in order for us to be the people God intends us to be. We were created for community. It's true in every walk of life, but it's meant to be particularly seen in the church, who are the people of God. Those loved by God and saved by God and brought into a relationship with him, into his very family where we can call him our Father. So as his children, how do we live together? How are we family together? How do we develop meaningful relationships with one another and cultivate this community together? Well, that's what we're going to be exploring together in the next 5 weeks as we explore this theme of community on Sundays in our teaching. We actually get a beautiful picture of what this community can look like in Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 47. It's the other Bible reading we had today. It's a picture of the very first church. And if I'm honest, it's a picture I think that many of us don't really know what to do with, because it's so different from our own experience of church today, or at least church before COVID-19 came along. That first church had just 4 priorities. They're there in verse 42 if we read it. We see they devoted themselves. Note that word devoted. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. Well, in today's church, I think many come to a service where we listen to a sermon, some teaching. We receive communion at varying frequency, the breaking of bread. But can we honestly say that we're devoted to fellowship, to prayer? Many people's experience of fellowship in church is drinking a cup of coffee for 10 minutes after a service, having a superficial conversation with somebody next to them, and then going home until we come back again next week and do it all again. That's not genuine community. That's not meaningful relationships. As John Stott helpfully puts it as he comments on fellowship in these verses in Acts 2, he says this. He says, fellowship, or koinonia, comes from the Greek word koinos, meaning common. I don't often quote Greek in talks, but actually this is quite important. First of all then, it refers to what we share in together, he says, which is God himself. It's simply our common experience of sharing in God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But fellowship also expresses what we share out together, what we give as well as what we receive. Koinonikos is the Greek word for generous, and it's to this word that Luke is especially referring to in Acts. And we see this generosity, don't we? This generosity of fellowship in the picture of this first church, where their relationships are certainly meaningful. They make a real difference in their life together. Just look. They are together and have everything in common. Some sell property and possessions and give to anyone among them who has a need. Every day they meet together in the temple courts, not just once a week. They break bread in their homes and eat together. They share life together over food because food's a great tool with which just to open up and have conversations. And they have glad and sincere hearts, praising God all the time. Can you see these are relationships where people are so generous with their very self? Their time, their energy, their resources, their needs. And over the next 5 weeks, we're going to look at what genuine community means for the church today. For us as Town Church. We're going to look at the cost of community, thinking about serving and being served, both of which we find quite hard to do. We're going to explore moving beyond the superficial in our relationships as we think about knowing others and being known on a deeper level, helping us to remove those masks that many of us wear. We're going to explore putting love into action, what it means to love and be loved in our relationships with one another. And then finally, of course, because we don't want community to be inward-looking, we're going to look outwards as extending community to others, which is the mission Jesus has given his church. And Mike and I believe this series is quite a timely one for us, speaking into the life of our church as we seek to rebuild for the future. Focusing our relationships as a church family. Relationships from which we can worship together and learn together and grow together and witness together. It's one of the reasons that we're trying house church. Because that focuses first of all on just being church rather than doing church. Wouldn't we like to see Town Church, in Town Church, the results this first church saw in Acts chapter 2? Where they enjoyed the favour of all the people, and the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved? You know, that excites me. That would get me out of bed in the morning, even on a Sunday morning. It would certainly get me to church on time, as the song goes, to see what God does in us and through us. We were created for community. We were made for meaningful relationships. So may God teach us, change us, and grow us to be the people that he desires us to be. Amen. Well, if you're watching this as part of House Church this morning, I've got a few questions that you might like to discuss together as you meet together this morning. You won't have time to do all of them. They'll be up on the screen after I've said them, but here they are. If you didn't manage to share earlier, then can I encourage you to share that most meaningful moment in your life from 2019? It's simply sharing something of yourself, which will, by doing so, just deepen relationships amongst you. Maybe you want to describe a time in your life when you experienced real community and connectedness with other people. And then talk about why was that? Where do you experience community now? Or another question, what's your experience of community as Town Church? Be honest, positively and negatively. And then finally, thinking about Acts 2. This would be a great question to think about. What would it look like to be generous with ourselves to one another? As I say, you won't have time to discuss all of those, but maybe look at them, pick some that seem relevant to you, and have a great time getting to know each other in community better.